Allora, buongiorno a tutti. Io come direttore del Nens e a nome delle organizzazioni che hanno promosso questo incontro, ICRIT e Oxfam, vorrei dare il benvenuto e ringraziare i parlamentari, gli accademici, gli economisti e tutti i presenti per aver accettato il nostro invito per una giornata così importante. In questa mattinata di studio e di confronto rifletteremo sul ruolo che i sistemi fiscali possono assumere nel perseguimento di un'equa distribuzione del reddito, insieme ai salari, con l'aiuto di alcuni tra i massimi esperti che si sono maggiormente impegnati sul piano nazionale e internazionale su questi temi diventati particolarmente sensibili. La polarizzazione della ricchezza prodotta da tutti, ma nelle mani di una ristretta cerchia di ultramiliardari, l'aumento significativo della povertà assoluta tra vasti strati della popolazione e il crescente impoverimento relativo che si sta diffondendo nel cosiddetto ceto medio, anche nei paesi economicamente più avanzati. Sono i fattori di un'emergenza sociale, economica e politica su scala mondiale che si avverte particolarmente acuta nel nostro Paese. Per questo abbiamo invitato questa mattina a intervenire i leader delle maggiori forze politiche che hanno dimostrato particolare sensibilità su queste tematiche e li ringraziamo per la loro presenza. Nel primo panel dedicato al quadro internazionale interverranno Joseph Stiglitz, premio Nobel per l'economia e professore alla Columbia University, Martin Guzman, già Ministro dell'Economia della Repubblica Argentina, Jayati Gosh, economista dello sviluppo, professoressa di economia presso l'Università del Massachusetts. E lascio con piacere la parola al professor Visco, che presiderà i lavori, per un'introduzione al tema dell'incontro.
First of all, I want to apologize to our guests because I'm going to speak Italian, and there is a simultaneous translation system that can help us to our public to follow our discussion. La questione delle diseguaglianze crescenti è il problema fondamentale della nostra epoca. È il risultato infausto e inevitabile della lunga fase neoliberista. Oggi affrontiamo questo problema in un breve convegno che si giova della presenza di ospiti di grande competenza e autorevolezza, approfittando del loro soggiorno a Roma per la partecipazione al convegno sulla giustizia fiscale che si è tenuto in Vaticano e della loro disponibilità, di cui li ringrazio. La diseguaglianza si manifesta oggi nei redditi, nella loro ripartizione tra salari e profitti, nei patrimoni, nelle opportunità, ma anche nella struttura dei sistemi fiscali, nella crisi dei sistemi di welfare, nella povertà crescente. Per loro natura, i sistemi fiscali non sono lo strumento più adeguato a ridurre la diseguaglianza. Infatti, se il prelievo complessivo deve raggiungere livelli del 40-45% del prodotto interno lordo, come avviene oggi in molti paesi europei, è inevitabile che aliquote molto elevate si applichino anche ai redditi delle classi medie. A fini redistributivi, invece, molto efficace è stata la costruzione nel secondo dopoguerra dei sistemi di welfare, istruzione, sanità, previdenza, assistenza. Ed è proprio questo il punto su cui la destra manifesta la sua avversione alle tasse, perché le tasse servono essenzialmente a finanziare la spesa pubblica e in particolare la spesa sociale. Tuttavia, contrariamente a quanto avveniva alcuni decenni fa, oggi il prelievo fiscale risulta chiaramente regressivo ai livelli di reddito e di ricchezza più elevati. Ciò è avvenuto mentre le aliquote più elevate delle imposte personali sul reddito venivano fortemente ridotte, quelle delle imposte sulle società dimezzate e le basi imponibili progressivamente svuotate. In conseguenza si è aperto un dibattito sulla opportunità di introdurre un'imposta patrimoniale almeno per i contribuenti più ricchi. Resta il problema di come realizzarla in concreto, partendo dalla necessità di disporre di apposite anagrafi patrimoniali che per esempio in Italia non sono disponibili. Analogamente le grandi imprese multinazionali hanno dimostrato una straordinaria capacità di eludere le imposte sui profitti, collocandoli presso paesi a bassa fiscalità o nei paradisi fiscali. Per contrastare questi comportamenti esistono le proposte dell'OCSE e dell'ICIC. Queste caratteristiche hanno riguardato anche l'evoluzione del sistema fiscale italiano, che inoltre si caratterizza per la perdurante evasione di massa e per la sua balcanizzazione corporativa, basata su una disparità di trattamento esplicitamente perseguita dal governo in carica e sempre più intollerabile. Tutto ciò non è avvenuto per caso ed è stato un contributo fondamentale alla crescita delle diseguaglianze all'interno dei paesi in tutto il mondo e alla crisi dei sistemi di welfare. E per combattere questa situazione negli ultimi anni si è sviluppato un movimento a livello internazionale di cui i nostri relatori di oggi sono leaders. In questo contesto la recente rielezione di Trump a Presidente degli Stati Uniti crea forte preoccupazione. Tra i primi atti della nuova amministrazione vi è l'uscita dagli accordi OCSE sulla tassazione delle multinazionali, la proposta di nuove e consistenti riduzioni di tasse per i più ricchi e per le imprese, l'abolizione del sistema americano di aiuti umanitari e la chiara tendenza verso la creazione di un sistema politico autoritario basato sulla manipolazione delle masse, sul sostegno di una nuova oligarchia plutocratica monopolista alla ricerca di rendite, contraria alla concorrenza e alle regole, in palese e sfacciato conflitto di interessi. Mi chiedo quindi se gli sforzi di analisi, di informazione, di divulgazione, di mobilitazione che molti di noi hanno compiuto negli ultimi anni non siano stati alla fine inutili. Quindi sono molto interessati a sapere cosa pensano i nostri relatori sul futuro che ci attende e su come possiamo continuare la nostra battaglia, che immagino diventerà ancora più difficile. E quindi con queste note poco ottimiste vorrei cominciare a dare la parola ai nostri ospiti, iniziando dal professor Stiglitz, che non ha bisogno di presentazioni, e ricordando che non abbiamo molto tempo, quindi in teoria si dovrebbe parlare 10-15 minuti, anche se possiamo fare una qualche eccezione appunto per il giorno. Ok, take the floor.
Well, thank you very much for this chance to share some of our ideas with you. I suppose Italy and the U.S. are going through different forms of suffering, but I hope you have empathy for the United States, because I think we are going through more suffering than you are. We have seen in the United States a level of greed, a government that seems to know no moral compassion. The sudden abolition of aid for poorest people in the world just shows an amazing lack of compassion, empathy, lack of concern about conflicts of interest, basic rules of governance that we had worked on for 100 years, transparency, the whole principle of democratic governance has been undermined in 3 weeks. One aspect of what we are seeing is an enormous accumulation of wealth. Economic inequality gets translated into political inequality, especially if you don't have the right rules. We have rules where money participates in politics. And so we've moved from one person, one vote to, I sometimes say, $1, one vote. But some dollars even have more power than other dollars. So we've really, what is at stake is our society, our democracy, but even our economy. Our economy does not function well when there's this level of inequality. And one of the important aspects or two important aspects of what is going on is the wealth begets more wealth. This intergenerational transfer of wealth, creating a inherited oligarchy. And the word that is being used now in the United States, we used to talk about Russia as an oligarch. And now everybody talks about the American oligarchs, and not in a positive way. It is a sign of opprobrium, the oligarchs that are now running America. Tax is a very important instrument for correcting these kinds of problems. Nobody likes to pay taxes, but as Oliver Wendell Holmes, one of our great justices of the Supreme Court, said, taxes are the price we pay for civilization. And I hope we're all here agreed that we want to have civilization. Taxes play a role not only in increasing efficiency, and I'll come to that, they can actually increase the efficiency of the economy when they're well designed. They have a moral value, and they create a kind of solidarity. If you have a good functioning tax system, it can create trust. If you have a dishonest, corrupt tax system, it will do the opposite and undermine trust and undermine solidarity. And these are absolutely essential for the functioning of any society, democratic society. You need, to use the words of the, French Revolution, you need liberty, freedom, equality,
fraternity.
What?
Fraternity.
And fraternity, solidarity. So you need all three of those, and taxes are an important part of achieving all of that. Over the last 40 years, 50 years, the right has spread a particular narrative about taxes and regulation. The narrative is that if you just lower taxes and lower regulation, you'll get faster growth from which everybody will benefit. Well, we've had 40 to 50 years of this experiment, and it has failed. And this is an experiment that has gone on not in one country, but in many countries. And when you do an experiment for that long in that many places, it should be clear what the answer is. We don't need the experiment anymore. It is a failed experiment. We know why it was a failed experiment. The ideas behind it were wrong. There never was a good theory of trickle-down economics, why giving money to the top would benefit everybody. There was never a theory of that. In fact, what we know is giving money to the top made the top more greedy. Musk doesn't seem to be satisfied being the richest person in the world. He wants to be even richer, ignoring conflicts of interest. So it is, there was never a theory behind it. And there was never a theory behind the notion that unfettered markets would lead to societal well-being. There were some special assumptions if there was no market power, if there was perfect information, if there were risk markets for every risk, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then under those conditions, the pursuit of self-interest might lead as if by an invisible hand to the well-being of society. That was the idea of Adam Smith. But a host of work, going back to my teacher, Ken Arrow, and to my work, showed that the reason the invisible hand is invisible is it's not there. That in the absence of those extreme assumptions, when there's imperfect information, imperfect risk markets, imperfect competition, you can make money, a firm can make money better by exploitation, by figuring out how to reduce their tax burden, rather than making better products. And we see that kind of exploitation over and over again. So I'm not going to go into the whole range of ways that good government has to constrain and guide markets. Markets are still an important force. So what I would argue, you need to regulate and constrain and guide. And that's particularly important. There was an AI conference in Paris. I went to some of the side things around that. And we had the Nobel Prize winners who invented AI. And they were saying, you have to put regulations to create an ethical and safe AI. Meanwhile, in another room, the guys who were making money off of AI were saying, take away the guardrails and let us exploit the rest of the world, regardless of the dangers. So that's really the kind of debate, and there are a lot of issues that surround the AI and surround each of the areas. But it should be obvious that without regulations, our oil firms would be polluting and the future of the world would be at stake. So we need regulations, we need taxes. And we're going to talk today just about part of the broad issue about taxes. So part of this narrative was that lower taxes would, but going back to Ronald Reagan, he said that lower taxes would generate so much economic activity that tax revenues would go up. Lower the tax rate and tax revenues will go up. One of the things that I've learned in my long life is never make a clear prediction like that. Because you can be proven wrong so easily. And within a year or two, he was proven 100% wrong. The revenues went down, there was a big deficit. And we've never had an example where you lower the tax revenue and revenues go up. So this idea that by lowering tax revenues you could make more, lowering tax rates you could get so much more activity, that's a fiction. But still, the argument on the right has been that it is very important to lower tax revenues. And a key point of Trump's agenda has been to lower taxes on billionaires and on corporations. Well, again, we've had experiments. We've done this over and over again. The last experiment by Trump was in 2017, where taxes on corporations were lowered significantly. And there was no new investment, no growth. There were some things that reached new records. Share buybacks. Profits went up because you were giving less to the government, you had more to distribute to your rich shareholders. And so they bought back their shares because that's a better way of getting money to the shareholders without paying taxes. Because capital gains tax were low. You only have to pay taxes on a fraction of what you pay back. So share buybacks in 1 year in the United States after they lowered it was $1 trillion. Money that could have been invested in more in growth. And so one of the reasons growth was low was that they lowered the tax and money was taken out of the corporations. From a theoretical point of view, this failure was not a surprise. The only thing that was a surprise is how long it's taken people to understand the analytics. The reason I say that with a little smile is I wrote a paper in 1973, I guess I was younger then, explaining that the corporate income tax does not lower investment. And it should be obvious that that's the case, because the corporate profits tax is not a tax on capital. It's not a tax on labor. When you pay the tax, you deduct labor cost, you deduct the cost of capital. In the United States, you can deduct the cost of the machine. In other countries, you depreciate, but the depreciation is a cost of machine taken over a number of years. The net effect is that you are able to deduct the cost of capital. What is the corporate profits tax? It's a tax on monopoly profits. It's a tax on what we call rents. And the simple notion is that a tax on rents does not distort behavior. You get rents because government has done basic research on the mRNA platform for a vaccine, and then Pfizer comes along and brings that vaccine to ordinary people, and Pfizer makes billions of dollars. Is it billions of dollars based on Pfizer research? No, it's billions of dollars based on public research. So they make a lot of money, not a surprise. The government pays the cost and they get the profits. And so what does the corporate profits tax do? It gets back some of the money that really belongs to the government in the first place, because the government did the research. But government today is involved more than ever in creating a society that functions. Why do I say that? You know, hundreds of years ago, we lived in isolated farms, and we could each, we had limited interrelations. Today, we live in a very congested urban setting. You need government to regulate the interaction. Water we get somehow. Our waste goes out somehow. It happens magically. We don't think about it, but it's the government in one way or another that organizes that. The roads are laws. You look at a lawless society like America, you realize there's not enough investment in laws and their enforcement. But in other parts of the world, it's even worse. The Nobel Prize this year went to a group of economists that discovered something that you might say obvious, which is you need good institutions and good laws for economic growth and a well-performing society. Where does that come from? That's government, and that has to be financed somehow. And equally important, when Adam Smith was writing 250 years ago, he talked about a pin factory. What do we talk about today? Innovation. What is innovation based on? Basic research. So the amazing thing of Musk is he talks about being a libertarian as he gets billions of dollars from the government. $500 million for Tesla, $11 billion in contracts for, he talks about a libertarian economy without a government. Where would he be without a government? Tesla wouldn't be there. SpaceX wouldn't be there. But basically, basic research requires government. The internet was a base result of government research. So an innovation economy is an economy in which the government is going to play a bigger role. Pandemics required vaccines. Government provided that. Did the basic research. We wouldn't be here without that basic research. But that costs money, and that means taxes. So what I hope I've convinced you is the importance of taxes in a 21st century economy. More important than in the 20th, more important than in the 19th century. Now, when you think about the design of taxes, obviously you have to think about efficiency, but equity and progressivity. One of the reasons I like the corporate profits tax is because it's such an efficient tax. But there are other efficient taxes. And most of those are also progressive. Another efficient tax is a tax on land and natural resources. Why are those efficient taxes? Well, if you tax labor, it's possible that labor would not work as much. The evidence on that is that there's some response, but very little. Capital, you might save a little bit less. Again, evidence is relatively little response, but there's some. But what about land? If you tax land, the land is going to get angry with you and say, I'm going to go to France because they tax me less. No, the land is part of Italy. And the resources are part of Italy. They can't just walk up and leave. So we say technically the supply is inelastic. So those are resources that belong to the people and should be taxed at a very high rate. There's another source of taxation that actually there are cases where taxes make the economy better. Sounds strange, but it's true. Pollution taxes. We live in a world where climate change is a reality in spite of the denial by, I ask my students, I say, climate change is a real problem. In my view, Trump says it's not a problem. Which do you believe, me or Donald Trump? My students all say that I'm right. So I guess I am. But the point, the point is that taxing pollution is a way to incentivize less pollution. So you get a double dividend. You get money and you get less pollution. There are other taxes on the environment. Speculation can lead to an unstable economy. Taxing speculation can stabilize the economy and generate revenue. So there are a whole set of taxes that we call them corrective taxes that raise revenue and make the economy more efficient. The final thing I want to talk about just very briefly is the context. We're a commission that talks about international taxation, and taxation has gotten much more difficult with globalization. It's one of the darker sides of globalization because globalization provides opportunities for firms, individuals with high wealth, super rich people, to avoid taxes. They move around. And one of the things our commission has been trying to do is to develop rules that make that kind of tax avoidance, evasion more difficult. And the international community, it's important for the international community to come together to reduce the scope for that kind of tax avoidance and tax evasion. I think my colleagues will talk a little bit more about what we can do to reduce that. The kind of rules that we had that began in the early part of the 20th century are not fit for purpose in the 21st century. The transfer price system, and we've been advocating a system, a formulaic system. There are some advances to the OECD in creating a minimum, but it was set too low. And then they, even after setting it too low, 15%, half of what developing countries have, 30%. But even then, they gave exceptions, carve-outs. So the real rate is not 15, it's like 12 to 13%. Really should be unacceptable. And then they had another provision for the allocating of taxing rights that was even worse. So there's been a move to have the negotiations move out of the OECD into the UN, which is where it should have been. This is an international problem, and the voice of everybody needs to be there. And that's why this UN Convention on Taxation is so important. And they're beginning now taking up terms of reference. Europe as a whole has not been very cooperative. Better than the United States, which has announced that it will not cooperate at all. But there is a sense in our meeting that it was probably a good thing that the United States drops out, because usually what the United States does is a very negative force. It keeps watering down the agreement, making it weaker and weaker, and then after it gets very, very weak, they say, we're not going to sign it anyway. So it would be better if you had a stronger agreement among the coalition of the willing. So I think it's good news that Trump has dropped out, but I hope I hope Europe engages in these negotiations in a meaningful way. There's one set of taxes that, as we move to the 21st century, particularly important, and those are the digital taxes. And taxes on cross-border services. Those, in the 20th century, people didn't really have those. These are in the 21st century, and our rules don't really adequately deal with that. And not a surprise to the digital giants, as good as they are in producing good products, are even better at tax evasion. And every country has to have a digital tax. So and has to have a better mechanisms for taxing cross-border provision of services. And so with that, I think we can open it up later after Jayati and Martin talk. Maybe they'll want to go more in detail. Let me stop there and hand it over.
L'elogio delle tasse, il che secondo me è una buona cosa, in particolare per i politici qui presenti, cioè che dovrebbero ritrovare il coraggio di parlare bene dei sistemi fiscali e delle tasse in generale, perché senza tasse non c'è civiltà, come ci ricordava Stiglitz. Quindi vabbè, è un po' un paradosso, perché almeno qui da noi chi parla di tasse rischia molto, no? Rischia critiche, attacchi, no? Discriminazioni, mentre l'ideale di tutti è avere gli stessi servizi e non pagare tasse. Comunque, ciò detto, continuiamo nel nostro convegno e darei la parola alla professoressa Gosh, che è anche una copresidente dell'ICRIT, che oltre a un economista dello sviluppo.
Thank you so much. It's really a great pleasure and privilege to be here. I'm really delighted. And of course, Professor Stiglitz has already laid out the basic outlines, so that makes my task much easier. I'm going to focus on some of the issues that he's mentioned with a little bit more detail. But, you know, he talked earlier on about the failed experiment of the last 40, 45 years. It wasn't just a failed experiment in its own terms. It has created the greatest concentration of economic power we have ever had in the world. And I think that's important. It's not just that it has failed to do what it promised to do, deliver growth, deliver better conditions for people, and all of that. It has actually created an imbalance of global power and concentration in the hands of very, very few people, really, maybe 100 people in the world that we have never experienced before. And that has all of the other implications that he mentioned. It is giving us huge inequality, which has become insupportable, giving us tensions of social and political kinds as well. But it is also giving us dysfunctional economies. Investment rates have been falling over the last 5 decades globally. And in countries like mine, where in India, we have embraced that neoliberal paradigm, investment rates are not just falling over decades, they have been falling systematically over the past 20 years, and especially in the last decade. So the only reason it stays up at all is because of public investment. Private investment keeps falling. So it's a dysfunctional economic system. It is obviously very, very dysfunctional for society and for the politics. It gives us the kinds of politics we are seeing. I don't need to tell you what that means. The politics of hatred and division and finding another that you can blame. So taxes are important partly to begin redressing that balance, also because it's part of the social contract to actually provide the essential services that Professor Stiglitz talked about. But I want to emphasize, we are not talking about taxing ordinary people. In fact, we are saying we have to tax those who can afford to pay. We want to tax the extremely wealthy, and we want to tax large corporations, especially multinational corporations, that currently get away without paying these taxes. The richest people in the world pay lower taxes than anyone in this room and than most workers in the world. Their tax rates are in many cases close to zero. Jeff Bezos of Amazon doesn't pay any taxes. Mr. Musk doesn't pay any taxes, personal income tax, because they have ways of avoiding it. The largest corporations in the world pay much lower tax rates than domestic corporations. Your domestic Italian industries, your small and medium enterprises, which were your pride and joy, they pay much higher tax rates, effective tax rates, than big multinational companies. So in our commission, what we're trying to do is to actually reduce that disparity, to make large corporations, global corporations, pay their fair share, to make the richest people in the world pay their fair share. And there are ways of doing this. Professor Stiglitz talked about this, that you can treat a multinational corporation as one corporation, not Apple Italy, Apple France, Apple US, Apple India, but Apple. And every country in the world says, this is my share of profits based on sales and employment, and I'm going to tax that share of profits according to my corporate tax rate, so that you will pay the same as my company here. You are not going to pay less than a company that is not based abroad. That's a very simple and basic idea. That essential idea was agreed to by the OECD, but as Professor Stiglitz said, the US and multinational corporations watered it down, until it was not all the profits that were to be shared, but only the taxes, the profits of the top corporations with more than 100 billion in revenue, only a quarter of those profits to be shared. So they watered it down. And having watered it down, the US said, no, we're not signing that anyway. So that solved that problem, if you like. But the idea, the principle, is very important, and it can still be done. And similarly, taxing the rich, the extreme wealthy. So one of the other ideas that was in the OECD, which is a good idea, again, that you have to have a minimum tax rate so that all countries are not racing into the bottom. What do multinational corporations do? They say, well, Ireland is giving me a better rate, so I won't stay in your country, I'll move to Ireland. In India, they say, well, Vietnam is giving us a lower rate, or some other country is giving us a lower rate, and they force governments to bring down the rates. If you have a minimum tax rate, and we had suggested, as Professor Stiglitz mentioned, we suggested an average of the global tax rates, 25%. And then, in fact, there is no incentive, because if some other country is charging less, the country in which that company is operating, you can take the difference. You can say you're paying less than you should be paying, so we are going to take that difference in our taxes. So there's no incentive for them to move around. Again, the OECD accepted that principle, but they watered it down to 15%, and effective rate closer to 12%, which is the same as the tax rate of Ireland, which is a tax haven, as you know, in Europe. So, in fact, it is a good news that the negotiations have moved in a way to the United Nations. And it's also good news, as Professor Stiglitz said, that US is not going to be involved in these negotiations, because they would try and water it down in the UN as well. But to get a proper result at the UN, we really need the cooperation of all countries. Developing countries are agreed. They are the ones who forced that movement. The Group of Africa pushed and pushed till they got that movement. So they are agreed that we need to have these changes. European Union has not been all that positive. But this is not something that is to the benefit of the European Union. This is to the benefit of some multinational companies who are in the European Union, but not the people, not the citizens of these countries. So, in fact, it is in the people of Europe's interest to have this, to have an agreement that would do this. Just as it is in the people of Europe's interest to have a global tax on the extremely rich. And I'm not saying, just people who have a few of your beautiful houses in Rome or some other place, but people who have billions of dollars, people who have hundreds of millions of dollars, people in, my country, even $10 million makes you extremely, extremely wealthy. So we are saying that extreme wealth, the 0.001% of our population, they should be taxed. Why? Because they get away with no taxes. I just told you. They have all these investment advisors who show them all the loopholes so they can avoid taxes. The proposal, which was passed by G20, which means our governments, Indian, Italian, all of them passed it. They agreed that we have to think of ways to actually do a proper wealth tax on the extreme wealthy. Charge a minimum of 2% of their estimated wealth. You can do it as a wealth tax, you can do it as a dividend tax, you can do it on some other aspect of income. But just that extreme wealth. And in many countries, that in India, if you just taxed the top 1,000 richest individuals, 1,000, and we are 1.4 billion people, okay? 1,000 individuals, you tax them 2%, we get 1% of GDP, which is double our entire health budget. I mean, it's true, our health budget is disgustingly low, but I'm just saying, you can really double the health budget with 2% of the wealth of the richest 1,000 families. They won't notice it. I mean, when you're holding billions or centimillions, you really don't notice that 2%. It's like a stock market fluctuation, really, for you, nothing. So this can be done. Again, if you have that as a minimum, it can force every government to do that, because there's no interest then that individuals will get in moving the money around. It's hard for developing countries to do it on their own. It really needs a global agreement. But even without the US, we can get enough countries on board. It will make all the difference. So this is something that is in the interests of European people. I think all of you know you have begun to see the impacts of budgetary cuts on social services, on social protection. We know the gender implications of that. We know what it means for children. We know what it means for education. I can tell you that what we are experiencing in developing countries is actually 100 times worse. So, in the competition for badness, Professor Stiglitz says right now US is ahead, and I agree. But, in terms of the human tragedy of the lack of fiscal resources, developing countries are in really bad shape. At least 80 countries are spending twice as much on just debt service as they do on health, education, and social protection put together. We have terrible nutrition indicators in so many countries, worsening nutrition indicators, terrible health indicators. We are spending less on health and education. We are denying women and children basic nutritional and health facilities that you need to ensure just minimal survival in so many countries. And we're not doing anything to meet the climate change challenges because we can't afford it. So the case for raising revenues is absolutely undeniable, but developing countries that want to cannot raise those revenues because the global system is like that. Because they cannot tax the multinationals, because they cannot tax the rich just move their money out. So we need to get agreements on this, which will enable developing countries to actually access the resources they critically need. And let's admit, we cannot rely on aid anymore. I think that is, we have to stop pretending. I mean, it may not be as brutal as the US, Trump's cutting of US aid tomorrow. It may not be as brutal, but we are already seeing several European countries declaring dramatic cuts in foreign aid. And we know we're not going to get the climate finance we need. All that billions to trillions nonsense is not going to happen. We know we're not going to get the money we need to meet our sustainable development goals. We know it's not coming. How are we going to manage dealing with these challenges? We have to have our own fiscal resources. We must generate them. So we need an international system that will enable us to raise them. So I really believe that this tax justice is crucial within your country, within Italy, within Europe. It's absolutely crucial. But it is crucial globally, because if you do not give developing countries with 85% of the world's population the ability to raise their own resources, we know what will happen. You are worried about migration, you'll have to worry about lots more than just migration. There is a huge potential global instability from allowing such levels of impoverishment and inequality and basic material distress across the developing world. And one of the easiest ways of doing this, which is a win-win for all the people in the world, not just the people of the developing world, but people here, people across Europe, people in the US, in fact, everywhere, would be minimal tax justice and international framework that allows that tax justice. So, I would really request public pressure, first of all, to make people here know that this is the situation and why it's in their own interests and what the purpose is. It's not to tax them. It's not to tax small houses and things like that. It's to tax the richest who are getting away with no taxes and the largest corporations that are getting away with almost no taxes. It's to get at those, the deep injustice and unfairness of that, provide the resources for basic services within our own countries, but also to relieve some of that huge inequality, the global oligarchy that we are creating in front of our eyes. In fact, Elon Musk's wealth has gone up by 42 billion since the election. So it's not just inherited wealth, it's also the ability to influence state policy and all of that. So we really have to address this on an urgent basis in all of our interests. It's not about being nice to developing countries. It's about certainly saving the planet, but it's also good for everybody within our countries. Let me stop here, thanks.
Bene, molto bene. Le cose che ci ha detto la professoressa Gosh riguardano la tassazione internazionale delle grandi imprese e la tassazione dei grandi ricchi, che sono esattamente le cose che sono entrate in crisi da alcune settimane. Cioè di questo non si parlerà più negli Stati Uniti e quindi probabilmente ci sarà un effetto a catena per cui questi argomenti saranno cancellati. Allora, qui c'è un problema che riguarda la politica europea, perché se noi vogliamo dare una risposta alla nuova linea politica degli Stati Uniti, il terreno della tassazione è decisivo, che noi dovremmo, a livello europeo, secondo me dovremmo, fare alcune cose, bloccare i paradisi fiscali interni all'Europa, ristabilire una tassazione minima dei redditi di capitale all'interno del continente, mantenere la tassazione delle multinazionali o la digital tax che noi abbiamo e poi vedere che succede. Io dubito che in Europa ci possa essere una maggioranza politica che va in questa direzione, ma la battaglia va fatta su questo, che poi è la difesa dei nostri interessi, della nostra tradizione, della nostra cultura, rispetto a una degenerazione evidente che colpisce il nostro principale alleato. E io non credo che dobbiamo avere un atteggiamento di appeasement, cioè non è il caso. Ci ho detto, io do la parola a Martin Guzman, che è stato ministro dell'economia in Argentina dal 19 al 22 e che quindi ci può anche aggiornare su quello che significa un governo, anche lì, questo, iperliberista, e anche un po' stravagante, insomma, cioè, perché se uno guarda dall'esterno, insomma, ecco, e vorrei sapere se poi questa storia della motosega ha funzionato oppure no, però insomma, quello andava con la motosega e prometteva tagli robusti. E perché io poi, conoscendo un minimo di storia, dubito che l'Argentina sia un paese adatto a applicare quelle ricette. Prego.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much for having us. it's never easy to talk about taxes, and I'm so glad to see a full room that wants to discuss taxes. It's always easier to talk about how to spend than how to tax. Well, it turns out that we do this pretty much all over the world. So if we were a Queen, the British music band, Joe Stiglitz would be Freddie Mercury, yes. Right? But you want to listen to Freddie Mercury, not to the bass player. So I'll try to be brief, and I will make 3 points. The first point is about taking stock of where we are on taxes and what this means for my region, Latin America. So Joe and Jayati were clear on what's going on. I think there was a breaking point, which is at the end of the Bretton Woods regime, the early 70s. It changed how the global economy gets organized. It had major consequences for the balance or imbalances of power. We saw this on the financial front. Financial globalization didn't lead to more efficiency, and it led to more financial instability. It also changed the balance of power between the states and the private sector. But it also matters for taxes, and the data is clear. Some of our colleagues have been producing great empirical work showing that also the incentives for tax avoidance have increased. And this happens when you have more capital mobility. With the abandonment of capital controls, this is something that we've seen all over the world. So the tax avoidance by multinationals, it's massive. And the consequences of that is that, and this is so clear in Latin America, and it has political consequences, is that the state ends up taxing more the small and medium enterprises that have less capacity to use tax havens, and also the middle class, the people. So what are the consequences? Anger with the state. There is lower quality of public services. You see informality growing. The formal sector, but not the large corporations, all the rest, get higher taxes on average, and that means that the state is delegitimized for many. So the solution to that problem should be, in my view, the one that people like Joe Stiglitz, Jayati Gosh push for at ICRIC, Tommaso Faccio there at the bottom, at the end of the room, which is let's resolve the problem of the international tax architecture. Let's have everyone contributing a fair share of taxes. But that's not how the world works. Power matters. So those who benefited from this situation managed to influence the global narratives and say that the real problem is the state. So we should have a smaller state. But that doesn't resolve the problem. Basically, what that means is to more inequality of opportunities. As Jayati explained, education, health gets affected. But what we are seeing now are political trends go into this direction of getting rid of the state, like Trump in the United States signing on an executive order that for the U.S. no longer supporting the global tax solution that imposes a minimum tax on the largest multinational corporations in the world. This is pretty much a modern version of kicking away the ladder of economic development. That's the title of a famous book by the Korean economist Ha-Joon Chang, because those who are kicking away the ladder of economic development are the ones who benefited from innovations funded by taxpayers. I mean, this phone, we wouldn't have the technology that we have in this phone without the investments funded by the states. I'm sorry, with Tesla, right? So that's not the right road for the world. The right road, it's the one that Joe Stiglitz and others are pushing for. As I said, big political consequences for Latin America. Let me talk briefly about Argentina. We have, as you said, use the word extravagant, which is probably falls short of what was actually happening. We have a government that won the election on the promise that it would do a normalization of the economy by adjusting, by cutting privileges to the cost. That was a word. The reality is that the fiscal adjustment fell on and the adjustment of the economy in general fell on the pensioners, fell on the workers. And at the same time that we saw a significant decrease in the real value of pensions and significant decrease in real wages throughout the year, we saw only tax cuts to the wealthy. The wealth tax that Argentina has, by the way, I was the one who promoted that wealth tax in 2019, was cut from a maximum marginal rate of 1.25% to 0.25%. And that basically was funded by the cuts to the pensioners that can't buy remedies. And the consequence of that is, of course, keeping everything else constant, more inequality. So we have a president who likes to please the rich. And it's actually a puppet of the powerful. Elon Musk tweets about him, and that makes him very famous in the world. But Elon Musk doesn't tweet about what's happening in labor markets in Argentina, in which people that lose the jobs in the formal sector don't find jobs of the similar quality, and they have to look for jobs in Uber or delivery platforms, which means much lower quality of jobs, and they have to work longer hours. So while you see in the world a very positive global narrative because the country risk decreased, and by the way, it decreased because the big adjustment in the economy led to a recession, and the recession led to a fall in imports, and that means that there was more foreign exchange, more US dollars to repay the foreign debt, the external debt. At the same time we see problems in the labor markets, but Elon Musk doesn't tweet about that. So you get a very biased narrative of what's going on. And actually the popularity in the country for the government is less than 50%. So Milei is not Perón, right? That's not what's happening in Argentina. We don't have a government with 70% popularity. But again, it's not the path that leads to broad human and economic and social development. It's not the example that other countries could lead if they want to resolve the problems of social inclusion and create hope in the population as a whole. So let me now move to the third and final point that I was asked, which has to do with a new narrative at the political level with progressive governments. And I want to make, first I think the idea of a new narrative has to begin with new actions. And the problem of international taxation is one that illustrates the stance from progressive governments. I can speak about this based on experience in 2021 when the international negotiations for the minimum global tax, the global tax solution took place. I was the finance minister of Argentina. So I saw what was going on also with the European progressive governments. And what I can tell you is that what I saw was a very shy, timid approach on progressive governments in Europe. So while we were pushing for a 25% global minimum tax on the large corporations, the US was pushing for 15%, and the European progressive governments didn't want to fight. They didn't want to take leadership. They were overly cautious, not trying to have problems with the position of the multinational corporations. And of course, that doesn't create much illusion. It's hard to get people active when you take a position that is that shy. So in my view, again, more boldness is needed. Without a more bold approach, it's going to be difficult to create hope. My hunch on this is that given that taxes are so important to create a real meritocracy, to create real freedom, as Joe's book, The Road to Freedom, explains, we will need to resolve the problem of international taxation. And resolving the problem of international taxation requires more access to information. Because if those with wealth, with assets, move the assets to another place, the states need to be able to see those assets. And my hunch here is that it's key to connect education with fiscal revenues collection. So something like what Australia did, and I think one of Joe's students was involved, the system of income contingent loans for the financing of public education. The idea that no one pays when gets public education, while the people are being educated, they don't pay. But after they graduate, they start to pay, and the payments are contingent on the income up to certain threshold. And of course, the problem is that you can move abroad and you can move your assets abroad. So the state needs to have more capacity to see those assets. But my view is that if the idea of access to information is linked to the financing of public education, which actually leads to social mobility, there will be more social acceptance. So that's, in my view, a step that could be more exploited. It will bring multiple benefits and will help us to change narratives on the progressive side for basically reverting the trend in which we're going right now. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Bene, adesso dovrebbe essere prevista una pausa per un caffè o qualcosa del genere. Riprendiamo quando? Tra un quarto d'ora contiamo. Va bene? So there's a coffee break.
Yes. You want to question? It wasn't clear from the schedule whether there was a question.